In 1995, 5 members of the Rensselaer Outing Club traveled to the wilderness in New York State to venture into a mysterious cave that spelunkers couldn't fully explore for over 100 years after its discovery. As they advanced, they found a tight labyrinth of stone that was nearly totally submerged in chilling water. With only a few inches of air to breathe, one caver made a disastrous mistake. A heroic, life-saving battle ensued, and the woman who famously walked with a broken leg to aid in her own rescue climbed down into the abyss once more to help these trapped cavers just 4 years after her own harrowing incident. Would she get there in time to save them? Keep listening to find out how this wild tale unfolds. Before we dive into the video, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to our channel. Currently, only 8% of our viewers are subscribed, but your subscription helps us create more content like this. Simply click the subscribe button, like this video, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. By doing so, you'll also help YouTube recommend our content to a wider audience. Without further ado, let's jump into the video. Clouded sky shrouded the midday sun as wind groaned through the barren trees just outside the town of Schoharie. Earlier on that October morning, light snow dusted the forest. But by the time the cavers reached the edge of the wilderness, the only evidence of precipitation was a partially soaked floor of leaves that squished beneath their boots as they hiked to a cave in the Gage Karst Preserve. This caving trip was planned by a club at America's oldest technological research university, the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. They brought full-body wetsuits to provide an insulating layer in the cold waters of the cave, and they also brought packs with food, water, and 2 backup lights in addition to their main headlamps or handheld lights. The party were no strangers to the outdoors, and even though it was under 50 degrees outside that day, and likely even colder in the shaded tunnels below ground, they felt ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. The members of the group were Eric Kirkner, Sarah Cutler, Thomas Howe, Joe Bailly, and Scott Stepanuk. Scott was likely the leader of the group, having been a lifelong member of the National Speleological Society. Scott was also a canoe racer, which was a skill that could be useful in Ball's Cave, otherwise known as Gage Cave. The cavern is named for its old owner, Simeon Ball, who discovered it in 1831, although some accounts call it Gage after the preserve it's found on today. After a short hike, the group came to a hill in the woods with a rocky outcropping and a crack that slid into the darkness. By the time they reached the cave, it was 6 p.m. and the temperature was dropping. Over the next few hours, the air above ground would plummet to barely above freezing. But they weren't going to let that stop them from exploring the lost passage of Gage Cave. The entrance to Gage Cave is a 75-foot straight drop that free hangs above the darkness. The group looped their ropes around nearby trees and anchored them to the ground and began their descent down the wet, mud-covered walls of the cave. Gage Cave now has a rugged ladder that descends to a small divot in the wall where cavers have to transition to a second huge ladder bolted to large wooden reinforcement beams at varying heights, though cavers are expected to tie off at the surface for safety. Near the bottom of the vertical shaft, a small rocky ledge stuck out at around the same area as the hole. Then, after touching boot to stone, the passage took a steep decline for another 30 feet before reaching a second, shorter vertical drop. After completing the second climb in the chilly air of the cave, the group splashed into a slow stream that coursed throughout the whole cave. Their wetsuits protected them at this early stage when the stream started around 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep. But after a decent walk, the stream sinks into 30-foot wide subterranean lakes. Ball's Cave contains at least 14 different underground lakes, and the main water passage extends around 2 miles, with a max depth around 200 feet below ground. Past cave trips used a small boat to traverse the stream, and this group could have used one of the boats, or they may have brought their own canoe. They may have even swam through the lakes in their wetsuits. But there are no accounts of how they completed this first section of the cave. As they progressed through the winding chambers, they marveled at the limestone walls, uniformly covered in small lines that mark layers of bone and sediment that built up gradually over millennia to form the magnificent structure they were exploring. The air was icy as they crossed the large lakes beyond the entrance. After a long journey, they reached a walking section that went into a room called the amphitheater, which had 100-foot-tall walls and massive speleothems. Advancing further, they used ropes to descend a hole at the end of the next passage. There, the outing club found themselves in the square room, where water trickled down the rocks, forming little steps. Following the slope down brought them to a corner with a small pool and a tiny, almost invisible arch that hung just above the spot where the walls meet with the cloudy water. This spot was the end of the cave for about 100 years. No caver dared explore the tiny river passage until scuba and cave technology advanced enough to protect them as they explored the passage. They weren't the first to go through the lost passage in Ball's Cave, but they were among a small group of trailblazers who braved the claustrophobic tunnel. This passage is known as the low airspace section, since that minuscule triangular dome of rock is the only space cavers have for air as they crawl along with frigid water up to their ears throughout the whole passage. The cavers had to practically lay on their backs, moving feet first, almost totally parallel with the floor, with just their necks bent upright to stay out of the water. One by one, they filed into the narrow tube. They were all able to fit, and at the beginning, they could all keep their faces above water. But as they progressed, they ran into an unexpected problem. Each movement created waves, which would be barely noticeable for small groups, but with this fairly large group, each wave crashed into one another, creating higher waves that reached the ceiling, splashing into the cavers, covering their faces, and making it even harder to breathe. The constructive interference of the waves wasn't the only problem they had to face. More people breathing produces more carbon dioxide, which could quickly suck all the oxygenated air out of the room and suffocate them if they moved too slowly or if they got stuck. The splashing waters slowed the lead caver's pace, which caused all the others to bunch up behind them, making the waves even worse and causing everyone to wait in practically ice-cold waters. Their wetsuits weren't designed to block waters this cold for this long. They weren't even out of the passage when they felt the cold begin to sap the life from their limbs. Thankfully, they were able to traverse this section without any major incidents, and after 2 hours below ground, they reached the battle room. They were all varying levels of cold as they exited the low air section, some worse than others. Beyond the low air section, the cave expanded into walkable sections, with long, spiky rock jutting out along the lengths of the chamber to signify old water height marks. Advancing even deeper into the cave, the water got deeper again, but the walls widened, becoming something like a sewage drain that they had to wade through. The bitter waters once again stole more heat from their bodies as they advanced. Further down, some of the rooms were stripped bare of the delicate limestone formations that made them so unique, as landowners broke them down and sold them to collectors and museums. After lamenting the destruction of the cave and completing their goals, the Rensselaer Outing Club turned around to leave Gage Cave behind. Now, to avoid another battle to breathe in the low air section, they decided to enter the waterlogged passage one person at a time to avoid sitting around in the frigid water and to avoid creating too many waves. The waters were high, but not unbearable for the first length of the return trip, but partway down, it would turn into the low air passage. Since the cavers would lose sight of each other along the winding length of the tunnel, they planned to signal with a yell when each member reached the low airspace portion to give each person just enough space to get through without wasting too much time. They picked Sarah to go first because she was the coldest. If she didn't go through it first, she might not be strong enough to complete the exit climbs after waiting around for the others to get ahead. Sarah hesitated as she braced herself for the shocking cold of the water. After a moment, She waded into the long tunnel and disappeared into the distance. After a few minutes, she reached the low air section and yelled to the group. As she sat down to complete the tunnel, she realized the water level had risen, making the passage even more cramped. It was hard to see since she was basically facing the ceiling the entire time, and she wasn't familiar with this cave and its routes. Still, she began her crawl through the tunnel. That was Scott's cue to begin his crossing. Pushing through the water, Scott felt tension well up inside him as he approached the low air space. He dreaded seeing Sarah stuck in the water, or worse. Well, she wasn't stuck on this side of the passage, which was a good sign. However, when Scott emerged from the square room, Sarah wasn't there. Meanwhile, back at the group, they heard the distant echo of Scott's yell. It was faint, but Joe took it as his cue, prepped his mind and body, and he descended into the water for his turn to cross. Following a chain of signals, Thomas and Eric also took their turns. However, when the last in line, Eric Kirkner, reached the low air section, he found Thomas still waiting on this side. Thomas relayed the game of telephone to Eric, telling him that Sarah was missing, and Scott went further into the square room to look for her. Scott's yell wasn't the signal to send Joe. He was trying to warn them that Sarah had vanished. Thomas and Eric went back to the low air passage to look for any sign of her. Sarah didn't realize it, but she had had two options for exiting the low air section. She could turn down an S-shaped tunnel or go straight. The straight route didn't lead to the exit, and it was blocked by a sump, a place where the low-air section of the cave had become a no-air section as the ceiling fell below the water level, creating a totally submerged passage. Eric and Thomas both followed the straight passage, not realizing it was submerged, and when they got to the sump, their hearts sank. They quickly turned back to the square room. Earlier, Sarah had assumed that the higher waters had flooded the exit, so she free-dove the first sump, holding her breath and opening her eyes in the murky waters of the cave until she got to a small pocket of air. But on the other side, the cave sumped again. She was already the coldest of the group, and finally submerging herself made her temperature drop even more. She took a few short gasps of air and dove under the second sump. This time, she emerged into a room. She thought she had made it back, but as she climbed out of the water, she realized it wasn't the square room. Sarah yelled in the cold, dark chamber, but got no response. As fear and cold started to twist her mind and body, she went back into the water and tried to dive under the sumps to find her way back, but the waters were too cold. Her body was too stiff, and her muscles were shivering and unable to perform the deft maneuvers she needed to survive the flooded sections. She managed to reverse in the tube of rock and return to the unknown room where she would wait, freezing and alone. Around this time, Scott was ending his search and returning to the square room. As he double-checked for any holes or any signs of her walking away, he heard a cry from Sarah, who attempted contact once more after returning to her trapped room. Scott followed her voice and found that she was in a room below the group, but the passage was blocked by heavy boulders that had broken down from the ceiling ages ago. Eric and Thomas got back to the square room to meet the others, and Scott informed them what had happened. Thomas knew that the route had sumped, but since Sarah got through it and he was comparatively warmer, he volunteered to follow Sarah's route, thinking that together they could find a way to safety. He went back down the S-tunnel, reached the first sump, held his breath, and dove beneath the waters. The first sump was unexpectedly long. He couldn't find the air, so he swam faster, his heart racing as he fought the urge to breathe in the cold, dark waters of Gage Cave. As his cheeks swelled, trying to hold back a breath, he reached the air pocket. After coughing and gasping in the small pocket of air, Thomas collected himself and dove the second sump. As he surfaced, he found Sarah on a ledge above the water, eating some food to regain some of her strength. Thomas reached her, and the pair discussed the situation. He immediately realized it was too dangerous to go back. They were both stuck in this side room, cold and isolated. After a back-and-forth shouting match through the rubble, Thomas informed the others that they were trapped. Eric, Joe, and Scott debated their options. They didn't want to immediately call for help. Instead, they brainstormed ways to help. They could either dig through the rubble or get scuba gear to help them through the sumps. However, going back for scuba gear would take far too long, and there was no way they could dig through the rubble on their own. After weighing their options, they realized that they had to get help to save Sarah and Thomas. Eric decided to stay in the cave to lend any support he could to the stranded cavers, while Scott and Joe would exit Ball's cave to get help. Joe and Scott flew through the rest of the cave and exited a little over an hour after they left the room. Once above ground, they walked to the nearest house where they could call for help, a house owned by Emily Mobley. The same Emily who, just 4 years prior, aided in her own rescue during a 4-day-long operation after a boulder broke her lower leg in the 1,604-foot-deep, 54-mile-long Lechugia Cave. After spending a long time trying to figure out Sarah's location and planning what to do, the sun had set, and it was getting late. Scott and Joe knocked on her door, but there was no answer. Meanwhile, back in the cave, Eric rummaged through his pack to find any pieces of metal he could use to hit the rocks and begin digging through the breakdown as fast as he could, splitting the rock and shoveling dirt and gravel out of the way. Through sheer force of will, Eric created a 15-inch triangular hole in breakdown. He made contact with Sarah and Thomas, and they tried to squeeze through the hole, but even Sarah, the lighter of the two, was unable to fit through the hole. Scott and Joe went further into the town and called the sheriff's office. Then they went back to Emily's and continued to try to wake her. By the time an ambulance arrived, Emily had finally woken up to help with the rescue. She suited up and brought a pack with extra clothes, heat packs, and food. While emergency personnel were waiting for cave rescuers, Emily climbed down the ladder and into the cave alone. Living just a stone's throw away from the cave gave Emily an advantage. She knew the Gage Cave like the back of her hand, so she quickly got to the square room to aid Sarah and Thomas. Using the hole Eric had dug, she delivered the care packages, and without wasting any time, she knelt down and helped Eric dig in the square room. After the minutes rolled by, Emily got concerned. She only led the charge back into Ball's cave because she thought Scott and Joe were coming back to help dig. But as time dragged on, there was no sight of the others. It turned out, the rescue crew and the others had thought Emily was going to come back to the surface after analyzing the situation. Then she could tell the teams exactly what kind of tools they needed to bring to help blast through the rubble. This whole situation emphasizes the importance of communication and the role of the controller or warden during cave rescues. Had a controller taken command of the situation immediately, they could have all been on the same page, which would have made the operation faster and far less worrisome for everyone involved. It's problems like these that turn rescues into body recoveries. Caving guidelines were still progressing back in the 90s, so rapid assessment of controllers wasn't guaranteed. And there were other assumptions that made the above-ground crew jump to conclusions. Past standards preferred written communication to pass accurate information between different parties. Today, with field phones, people can verbally communicate, allowing the receiver to write down and consolidate any necessary information, which can then be passed on through a chain of command instead. If they had planned to use phones, a second crew would have entered the cave even if Emily wasn't returning to the surface. But instead, the above-ground team was stalled. Emily and Eric dug through the dirt and grime and hammered the boulders with all their might, but they were struggling. Emily was still tired from only a few hours of sleep, and Eric was cold and exhausted. After a few hours, the pair managed to crack one of the larger pieces of stone, sending its rubble crashing to the floor below. And its crumbling sent another stone crashing to the floor with an echoing thump. With the hole expanded, Sarah and Thomas felt that they could get through, but it was just a little too high for them to reach now that the structure of the rock had changed. Working together without safety harnesses to keep them tethered to the floor above, Emily and Eric reached down into the tunnel, grasped Sarah's hands, and pulled her to the ledge of the hole. Sarah gripped the rock and pushed with all of her might as the pair helped her to safety on the floor of the square room above. After taking a moment to breathe, they repeated the process with Thomas and got them both up to relative safety. But they still had to exit the remaining distance of Gage Cave, and they were worried about the above-ground crew. They still had no idea where they were. A cave-in or flood could be blocking the exit. But there was only one way to find out. They moved slowly as their stiff bones ached in the icy waters. After what felt like an endless hike, the group saw lights approaching. They gave some banter, assuming it was the rest of the Rensselaer Club, but the approaching lights weren't from Joe and Scott. The rescue team had finally reached the cave and gone inside. The approaching rescuers paused the group to give a medical assessment. They were in bad shape, but since they had made it this far, Eric, Thomas, and Sarah were cleared to exit on their own accord. They continued to move toward the surface together. Sarah and Thomas were both very weak, so the rescue team helped them up some of the final climbs using ropes and harnesses to keep them safe. After hours of struggle, all members of the team made it out of Ball's Cave alive. Thomas and Sarah rode in the ambulance to stay in a nearby hospital where they were treated for hypothermia. Eric may have joined them, since even though he didn't go through the sumps, he had stayed in near freezing temperatures with the trapped cavers. Some of the members of that group may have hung up their headlamps and boots for good, but others kept on caving. Scott became a scholarship judge for the National Cave Rescue Commission and an instructor in the Northeast Mobile Search and Rescue Team, where he learned from past events like this one to help other cavers who found themselves in dire situations. Now, even with rising oceans, Gage Cave hasn't flooded yet. Would you dare to travel through the low air passage? Let us know in the comments section. Click the like button if you enjoyed this crazy true story of some of caving's most legendary figures. Did Emily's story interest you? Well, then check out this link to our video detailing Emily Mobley's insane self-aided rescue with a broken leg, and also make sure to subscribe to catch the next incredible rescue story.